If you're showing up with confidence as a coach, you're being playful, you're being experimental, you're not overthinking, you're at your best, you're leaving a lot of space between the client's offering and your next question. You're calm, you're dancing in and out of what we call creative tension. So you know when you kind of know when to mirror the client's behavior, you know when to do the opposite, the way the client is behaving. And you're unruffled, while confident, with the client being maybe unable to answer your question. You're unruffled by the client asking you to clarify the question because they don't understand your question. You're even unruffled with your client saying, what kind of question is that? Or I really don't like that question, or complaining maybe in some way about your question. All of that doesn't ruffle you when you're being confident. Sometimes we say the map is not the territory. And improving confidence in a way depends upon what an individual coach needs in order to feel confident. People are different in terms of what they need to be present to be able to feel confident. Generally speaking, as a sort of a general rule, we say learn the models inside out, learn the map, and then forget the map. Now, for most people that are beginning, if they feel well prepared, they're more likely to be able to bring confidence into their game in a particular session. So what does it mean to feel well prepared? Well, firstly, understand, go back to basics again and again and again, understand the models, understand the tools that we offer, but also, more importantly, understand the first principle behind the tool. What's the tool doing? Why do we ask particular questions in a particular way? Try to understand what are the first principles behind the various methods that are being taught to you. And if you understand the first principles, then you don't have to worry about the models anymore. You kind of know what coaching is doing and why. But at the beginning, at the very, very beginning, you need to, become familiar with the models and the tools and the frameworks that are taught, whether it's by us or whoever's teaching you. Another thing that is always useful to do is what we call neural priming. So neural priming is where you orient yourself to the session before the session. You ask yourself some questions like, reminding yourself what are the client's goals, or what they were, what happened in previous conversations, and in particular reminding yourself what might happen in, it's like making a not being married to the prediction, but asking yourself what might go wrong in this session that might undermine my confidence. And now, while the seas are calm before the session, how would I love to be able to respond when and if this happens in the session? Right. So that's kind of knowing what might, it's almost knowing what is my own growth edge for that session. What is it that I am working on in this session? What is my own improvement goal for this session? What is my practice for this session? Oriented as far as possible with, what's happened in previous sessions. How have you become unbalanced? What has undermined your confidence in previous sessions with this particular client? And then reflecting back on that and asking yourself, ideally, how would I have loved to have been able to show up in that particular situation? And that gives you some chance of getting ahead of it next time. So having a conversation with yourself before the session about what might happen and how would I love to be able to respond when it happens. And that makes it much more likely that you can bring that forth. And then just making sure that if you do become agitated during the session, if you feel that you're going a bit off balance and maybe confidence is waning, just bring yourself back to the present moment. Take a couple of breaths, take a pause, feel your feet on the ground, feel your hands on your lap, maybe. Just take a pause and, and maybe you can even think about asking one of those wild card questions that I love so much. Like such questions as, okay, so what's happening with you right now? Or, so what are you learning from what's been said so far? What are you learning from what you are saying? Or what are you learning from what you are thinking about yourself, about your situation, about your goal, about what you really care about? Questions like this bring you back. They interrupt your own negative mental pattern that might be running with you and bring you back to focusing on the client. What are you learning right now? What are you thinking about right now? What are you learning from what you're thinking about right now? All these are great questions and they sound good and they bring you back. It actually sounds like you're being a coach when you ask questions like this. It makes you feel that you know what you're doing, even if you're off balance. And that'll give you space, because almost invariably when you ask questions like this, the client goes into a reflective mode, which gives you more time and space. You can see that your clients, maybe their eyes are moving like this, or maybe they might say, oh yeah, good question, or something like that. And that, of course, brings you back to your senses. I think if you feel intimidated by your client, you've got this kind of reverse power distance going on, then it's really important that you prepare yourself well for the session. It's particularly important that you ask yourself, what's the worst thing that can go wrong here? And if you think about it, what is the worst thing that can go wrong here? The worst thing that can go wrong is you're going to ask a question and the client, maybe you're going to be scared of the client's reaction to that question. I think that's in practical terms, that's the impact of being intimidated by your client, that you are going to carry into that meeting a feeling of what we call a child-parent relationship. It comes from transactional analysis. And what you want, the relationship that you want, is what's known as an adult relationship, where you feel that you are okay and you feel that your client is okay. So it's I'm okay, you're okay. It's transaction between two adults. But if you're going in there feeling intimidated by your client, you're in a child-adult relationship, which means, I'm not okay, you're okay. So that you're carrying that mentality, I'm not okay, you're okay, into that relationship. Otherwise, why would you feel intimidated? And somehow you need to find a way of moving your mind into a child, an adult relationship. I'm okay, you're okay. And so you might need to do a little priming before that. Remind yourself of what you're like when you are at your best. Bring that back to mind. Sit with that. Let that install. Rehearse situations where you have felt intimidated by this particular client. And bring to mind, see if you can rehearse, again, while you're not in the session, ahead of time. How can I move my mind back into this adult way of thinking rather than child-adult? What are the conditions necessary for that to happen within me? What is it that brings me to my best in situations like that? We've all had peak experiences of being at our best with people that we feel perhaps are more powerful than us. And we just need to bring that back to mind. And again, that's neural priming again, really. Give yourself a lot. And again, if you're feeling intimidated, just make sure, you need to anticipate what your mind is doing in a way and do the opposite of what the mind wants to do. If your mind wants you to speed up and talk fast, slow down and speak more slowly. For example, dialectical thinking is another thing that you can do. If you're feeling agitated, tell yourself you're feeling great. If you're feeling that the client doesn't like you, tell yourself that it's quite likely that the client is not thinking the way that you're thinking. generally speaking, when we build stories about not being liked by our clients for whatever reason, it nearly always turns out not to be true. Where it can become true is when we react to that feeling by going off balance, waffling on, or wittering, or jumping into advice giving, which is so common. That's one of the things that we do when we feel off balance, is we try to restore the balance by coming across as an expert in something. We don't want to be doing that in a coaching situation with a powerful client that almost certainly knows more than you do about their subject. That will just make it worse. So notice the mind's tendency to do that and back off from it and just be the coach. Just ask simple, short, succinct, concise, otherwise succise questions. And then you'll know that you're doing well, that you're doing your best. As long as you know that you're doing, and again, maybe this is another mental orientation that you can bring in. As long as you are doing your best, as long as you know that you're being at your best, you won't worry so much about how the client is reacting to you. You'll have that egoless self-confidence that arises when we're just oriented towards the client and what is useful to them, rather than oriented towards our own ego, worrying about what the client is thinking about us. That's an ego story. Knowing that even if it does go horribly wrong, it's not the end. It's never the end. In the worst case, because sometimes you're predicting, oh, the client's not going to like me, they're going to cut me off, they're this and that, they're going to gossip to other people about what a useless coach I am. I mean, all these stories are coming up. Nah. If you believe those stories, you're in trouble. It's never the end. There's always the next client. There's always the learning. There's always the possibility of, rather than walking out of the session and beating yourself up, which is what you're predicting that you're going to do, which is why you're feeling so bad, you should worry about how you're going to treat yourself afterwards. Yeah. But know that we can learn from any mistake that we do happen to make. Yeah, we're going to make mistakes. Absolutely we are. But when we know that we can learn from them, we don't have to beat ourselves up about those mistakes. We don't have to be guilty and shameful about every mistake we make. We can set it aside and ask the question, so if this happens next time, how would I love to show up? Which is the learning zone. When we know that we can do that, we begin to flourish. And then we're less likely to make that mistake in the first place. It's a good question and quite difficult situation. I mean, I've been there myself, of course, as a younger coach, let's say. Yeah. How can you challenge a difficult client? You know, in a way, it is a good question, and you need to, firstly, you need to go back to the basics of what's going on with you when you feel agitated or off balance by your powerful client. And actually what you need to do is to ask a challenging question in the middle of that. And you need to remember that, as part of your priming, maybe at the beginning, part of your contracting with yourself. The neural priming, in a way, another way of looking at neural priming is contracting with yourself. It's a very important part of contracting with yourself. I mean, I think David Clutterbuck calls that conversation number 1 in his 7 conversations model. That contract with yourself is, part of what you can ask is, when I'm feeling off balance, if I'm feeling off balance, how can I remember to ask a question which can it's not putting the client off balance. It's not really what we're trying to do. But in a way, it is. Because it's only when we go off balance in the presence of a self-possessed, compassionate, other human being. It's only when we go off balance in the presence of a self-possessed, non-judging, compassionate, other human being that we can learn. When we go off balance in that presence, then that's where we learn from our experience, right? So, and we need to do the same. We need to just remember what is our job. Our job is to be a compassionate, self-possessed, non-judging other human being. And we're also, as part of that, we're not judging ourselves either. Because if we're judging ourselves, then we are not going to be showing up at our best. There's going to be other stuff going on. So how can we challenge a difficult client when we're feeling off balance? Well, what's the first step? To go back to the basics, you go back to the molecule of courage, because it requires you to show courage. And courage means that you need to be present with the fact that you have the opportunity to practice courage. I would say that if you just remember that, oh, it's almost like, oh, I'm feeling off balance. Oh, good. Now is my chance to practice. Right. And then we practice being at our best in that situation, which we probably rehearsed ahead of time. What kinds of questions can I ask that might bring me back to balance? In what way could I challenge the client to take the emphasis off of my own mind and put the work onto the client rather than with me? Because if I'm feeling off balance, you can guarantee that I'm doing the work. And of course, our role as coaches is to have the client do the work. So what is the question that I can ask so that the client is doing the work rather than me having to do the work of trying to ingratiate myself with the client all the time? But that requires, just going back to the atom. Sorry, I didn't finish off on that. You need presence is the ability to know that there's something to practice in the moment before, and patience is just being patient with these sensations that are washing over me right now of discomfort. Just for a couple of seconds, just sitting with them and going, oh, here's my chance. My chance to be at my best. It's my chance to practice courage. Who doesn't want to practice courage? And you could almost ask, what? Of course, you have to be curious here. You need to know. You need to be curious and then trusting. Curious, oh, what's the story that's driving me? Is it true? No, you probably already worked that out. It's just remembering that you've worked it out. It's not true. Not going to kill me, this. I'm still going to be breathing at the end of this session. It's going to be okay. Okay, now I've got space to move, trust, and then letting go, and then moving on, bringing oneself back to maybe the kinds of questions that I put into my own personal arsenal that I know are going to bring me back to the present when I'm feeling off balance. Make sense? I think, it's interesting that, well, number one, these are rare. So, it's going to be pretty rare that will happen. I mean, it does happen occasionally. Many times it happens almost. And it doesn't actually happen, because it's often our own ego that drives that. And we say things like, oh, this client's a drama queen, I don't want to work with them. It's slightly unskillful, right? And we need to be patient with all of that. Sometimes we make predictions and assumptions about the way that our client is, which are not true, or they may not be true. And even if they were true, that's the very reason why they want a coach or need a coach. We put our emphasis instead on our own ego and how we feel violated by the way the client is interacting with us. But remember, it might be exactly that reason why you're being asked to work with that client. So we need to be careful of our own predictions and egos. But if we should decide that we would like to withdraw, skillfully decide, then you need to know it's the right thing to do to start. But let's say that you are convinced that is in fact is right, either for you or for your client. And again, it won't happen very often, but the way to position it is always position things like this as being in service of your client. You could say, so that you feel good about it. You're not saying, oh, I can't work with you. You're too much of a drama queen or whatever it might be for me. You just say, I don't think I'm the right coach for you. I feel you may be best served by a different coach other than me. That kind of thing is always the way to do it. You put the attention again on the client and their own. Well, as a coach, you should never act in a way that is in service of your own discharge of an uncomfortable emotion. And we say in your personal life as well, as a transformational coach, you should try not to act, try, and I use the word try, because this, you can't put it off, but you should have the aspiration not to act in service of your own emotional, the discharge of your own uncomfortable emotions. At least that's the aspiration, but you should certainly do that when you're interacting with your clients or your client sponsors. That is really the time where you have to practice that. So turning down a client always needs to be, you need to think of it. It's not, you can fake it till you make it, but you do need to think genuinely that that is the right thing for the client. I think most coaches know the answer to this question. They just don't do it. I mean, if I was even in a training class and I ask the question, what do you do when you notice your client is upset or agitated? Most of them actually know. They have to think about it a bit. And we don't like to think about things. That's the problem. Especially when we're in a conversation with someone, we don't like to take a space and remember. We like to go straight in with an answer because that makes us, we think that makes us look good. But actually what makes us look good is if we stop and pause, take a breath, and maybe even say to the client, oh, that's an interesting observation. Thank you for sharing. I've done it many times with the client, where a client has said, oh, a client has said something about me maybe in the session. Well, that's an interesting observation. Thank you for sharing. I'll reflect on that one. Knowing that we can do that, we have that resource to be reflective. Now, if I ask that question, that very question in a training program, most people are going to get the right answer. They're going to say, well, I'm going to ask a question. You might say, oh, I noticed something. I don't know quite what I noticed, but there seemed to be something going on when I asked that question. What was happening? And if the answer is nothing at all, then fine. You say, would it be useful for you if I share an observation about what I just observed? The client may say yes. If they're agitated, they're going to say yes. Again, all of these things, because if your client's upset or agitated, it means that they are not in the present moment. They're in their mind. And if you are reacting to their agitation, you're not in the present moment either. You're up in your mind, right? So now you've got two people in a session, in a conversation, where two of them are both up in their minds. Somebody needs to break that and bring it back to what's happening right now. So the question is something like, what's happening right now? But you wouldn't ask it like that. Basically, oh, is it useful for you if I share my observation at this point? It seems that something's happening. Is something happening? Is that observation on target? What's happening? That brings it all, because in order to reflect on what's happening now, by definition, that has to be done in the present moment. So it breaks the flow of agitation. It's known as a pattern interrupt, brings everything back to the present, and then we got to restart effectively, right? In order to do that, you're going to have to be very present. Otherwise, you're just going to get caught up in your flow. You're going to need to notice those opportunities. You're going to be on the autopilot highway, missing all the exit signs. Best way to defeat that tendency is just to go into the session telling yourself, I'm going to be slow, I'm going to be steady, I'm going to leave a lot of space, I'm going to be aware of my own experience and what it's telling me, and I'm going to be aware of how to manage that experience. But if the client has obviously, if it is perfectly obvious that the client has not enjoyed the question that you've asked for whatever reason, and I have had it, by the way, you just basically say, may I inquire what's happening with you right now? It seems to be, sometimes I've said, seems to be some agitation in the space between us. I've said that before. And then they might say something. And then you say, I've often said, look, I apologize for the fact that this question has offended you, or something like that. Whatever they say, you can, because obviously you don't want to offend the client, right? You might want to challenge them, but you don't want to offend them. And part of our role is to be non-judging, compassionate. In theory, if we're being non-judging and compassionate, we may accidentally offend the client, even though we are that human being. We may say something that is being misinterpreted by our client. In which case, we can say so. Look, I'm sorry that offended you. There was no intention for me to offend you. They'll probably believe you. and then I might say, may I ask, what was it about what I said? What were you interpreting? I said this many times. What was the interpretation of your? How did you interpret the question in such a way that you interpreted that you became offended? I'd want to know how they interpreted my statement or question in order to bring up that emotion of feeling offended. Why do I want to do that? It's because I want them to become self-aware of the patterns that run within them of feeling offended. Because if you're going to feel offended all the time in your life, you're not going to have a very good life. So sometimes it can be useful for the client to know what it is about what others say that cause them to be offended, so that they might then be able to ask the question about whether there's any threat to them that is creating that sort of sense of vigilance. Yeah, I mean, if I have offended my client, I will inquire firstly around what I'm noticing in the somatic field, then asking for the emotion, or whether there was any emotion behind that action that arose in the somatic field, and then ask what was the interpretation that they made of what I had said that caused that emotion to arise. And I want that partly for their self-awareness, and partly so that I can also learn that maybe I've got to be careful how I say things because it might offend clients. Certainly without agitation, I would certainly handle that type of thing without agitation. If the client seems to be too busy to attend to coaching, we need to be compassionate. We need to understand their perspective, and we need to inquire. And I've asked this kind of question before with clients, is this the right time for you to be involved with the coaching program? Are we working on the right goals? Because it might be that what's distracting them, somewhere within that distraction, may be the real goal. Or maybe the goal is around how to manage those distractions, right? So it's always the weighing up that only the client can do. Is our work more important than the other things that you've got going on in your life? Are these goals that we're setting together more important or less important than other things that are distracting you in your lives? Is the distraction actually the distraction, or is the coaching the distraction? You know what I mean? Are the other things that are going on in their lives distractions, or is the coaching the distraction from other important things that are happening in their lives? We don't know. Don't make any assumptions. Well, I mean, I think the most important practice around confidence is to introduce the space between stimulus and reaction, so that you can respond. Without that, nothing else can work. You know what I mean? So once you've got that space between stimulus and response, which fundamentally is that mindful space, that moment of actionable self-awareness, that moment of, oh, here it, oh, look at what's happening to me, without being caught up in it. The moment you've got that, you've got a really good chance of remembering what's important to you in terms of how you show up. Remembering what brings confidence. You need the compass. You need to know what brings confidence for you. But knowing it doesn't help you unless you've got the space to bring it back. If you've got the space to bring it back, you may be able to bring back what you know about how you bring yourself back to balance when you're feeling unbalanced. So you could say that, the various practices that can increase the apparent space between stimulus and reaction, the apparent space, are practices that are worth doing. So the practices under the presence build the neural architecture of giving yourself that space. you go back to the paper that we wrote on mental qualities, I think there's one on presence and patience. And there's a few things in there that can help you with that. But such things as just intentionally introducing a space between stimulus and reaction. It could be as simple as noticing that and you need to do these practices with the intention to practice. So you could say to yourself, oh, for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to practice with ... I'm going to practice with, for example, noticing a WhatsApp message coming in or a banner on my computer and just noticing it, going, look at that. I feel compelled to answer that right now. You know what? I'm just going to sit on that for a few seconds. I'm not going to look at it. I'm just going to keep my attention right here, unless it requires attention. But I'm going to practice with making a conscious choice. All of these things, and there's many, many of these kinds of practices that you can do. Sitting in a conversation with somebody, practicing just for 5 minutes with keeping your attention fully on this person and kind of tuning out all potential distractions. Because remember, a distraction is only a distraction when it becomes a distraction. Before that, it is a potential distraction. It isn't an actual distraction. It's just a phenomenon that is arising in the 6 fields of your experience. That's all. It's only a distraction when your mind grasps onto it and does something with it. Then it's a distraction. So you can practice with all of these potential distractions. And when you do that, you're building the neural infrastructure of executive control. It's known as executive control, your ability to manage your attention. One thing as a last thought around this whole topic of confidence, but it also applies to everything else in coaching, being off balance. Bring cheetah mind to your experience. Cheetah mind is a mind which slows things down in order to speed things up. A mind which spends, a cheetah spends most of its time just sitting and waiting and doing absolutely nothing, watching, waiting, so that when it's ready to go, it goes fast.